Hello, everybody, and welcome to Friday Apocryphal Podcast, your one-stop shop for everything Friday Apocryphal and podcast. And boy, do we have a show for you today.
Nailed it.
We're great.
Yep.
I think you guys
absolutely
have to
amazing.
distinguish the show by saying something other than, boy, do we have a show for you today.
And
No, I
That'll
don't think-
really
I don't
throw
think
you
so.
off.
And wowee, do we have a show for you?
Shoy. We got a shoy.
Yeah, a show for you today.
Amazing. Excellent time wasting.
Incredible.
Yep. Well, today we're covering 2 chapters.
Yes, 2 chapters, but they're 2 very long chapters.
Extremely long chapters.
I also feel like they're pretty interesting chapters.
Yeah.
And they're all metaphor by animal.
Well,
Yes.
You know,
Yes, that is why it is, in fact, the animal apocalypse.
amazing.
Well, what's the metaphor?
They're all animals.
No. What's it for?
I don't know.
So I'm gonna read.
It's just a metaphor.
I'm gonna read 89, and you're gonna read 90. Is that
Yeah.
how we're doing it?
Yeah, that's totally fair.
All right. Well.
And by the way, if you haven't seen the Council of Constantinople video, you should go watch it.
Yeah,
Later.
absolutely. Why haven't you watched it yet? Go check it out later.
Later, not right now.
Not right now.
Right now, you're doing something else. You're doing something that's pretty important right now. So once you're done,
You're busy.
yeah, you're busy. You got no time for family or friends. This is more important
Unless
right
you're
now.
telling them about this right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
second priority must be
All a priori.
This is the most important thing in life.
All right, well, yeah, we can hop right into the reading.
Let's do it to it. Noah and the flood. This is chapter 89. And one of those 4 went to one of the white bulls. Ethiopic reads those white bulls. And taught it a mystery.
Right, because in the Ethiopic, it would be like, this was already referenced.
Mm. Trembling as it was. 3 manuscripts read without his trembling. Aramaic omits the phrase. It was born a bull, but became a man. And he built himself a vessel, Aramaic, Ethiopic, a large ship.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yes. And dwelt in
This
it.
was an animal.
It was born a bull, but became a man.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Incredible.
And he built himself a
Oh,
vessel.
yeah, and one of the things about becoming a man, when things become men in the animal apocalypse, they are
Angels.
being, being
Maybe we should go over
deified
what
or
all
being angelic.
the counterparts for comparisons are again at some point.
Well, the bulls are humans.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's several
Specific
types.
humans. We'll talk
Specific
about them.
humans.
Yeah.
Yes.
And dwelt in it, and 3 bulls dwelt with him on that vessel, and the vessel was covered and roofed over them. Aramaic text in verses 2 through 8 is generally shorter than Ethiopic, which is followed here because it is complete and Aramaic is fragmentary. Part of the difference seems due to different cosmologies. The Aramaic as a straightforward summary of Genesis, Ethiopic depicting the cosmos as a great building with a courtyard set on earth. Okay. And again, I lifted my eyes toward heaven, and I saw a high roof and 7 sluices on it. And
Sluices?
Sluices.
I don't even know what that is.
And those
Sluice.
those sluices were pouring out much water into an enclosure. Lawrence, look that up. What the hell is a sluice?
Sluice. Yeah, it's not in this commentary.
Ooh, really?
It is not.
Oh, no. Well, while you're looking up sluices, I'll read. And I looked again, and look, fissures opened up in the floor in that large enclosure, and that water began to bubble up and rise above the floor. And I was looking at that enclosure until all the floor was covered with water. And water and darkness and mist increased on it, and I kept seeing the height of that water, and that water had risen above that enclosure and was overflowing that enclosure and stood on the earth.
So what was the spelling for sluice again?
Sluice.
Okay. So it is a sliding gate or other device for controlling the flow of water, especially one in a lock gate. Okay.
That makes sense.
Now we know.
Well, thank you. I'll use that in my next D&D scenario. We'll have a bunch of sluices.
Yep.
And I'll flood the room.
And all the cattle of that enclosure were gathered together until I saw them sinking and becoming engulfed and perishing in that water. And that vessel was floating on the waters, but all the bulls and elephants and camels and asses sank to the bottom together with every animal.
Yes, so the offspring of the Watchers are the elephants, camels, and donkeys, or in the translation, asses.
Yes.
Not only is this clever use of allegory, since these animals would indeed be monsters if born from cattle, but the words themselves in Aramaic are puns and anagrams for the Nephilim, giants, and Eliud of Enoch 7:2. It cites Millick's work, 1976, but we don't have that.
Oof. Someday. Yep. So they're sinking, and they sank to the bottom together with every animal so that I could not see them. And they were unable to escape, but perished and sank in the deep. And again, I saw in the vision until those water channels were removed from that high roof, and the fountains of the floor were stopped up, and other abysses were opened, and the water began to descend into them until the floor was uncovered, and that vessel settled onto the floor, and darkness withdrew, and it became light.
So for anyone that isn't following along, this is about the flood.
Yes, this is.
If it wasn't
flood
glaringly
story.
obvious.
If it's pretty obvious. Waters, they're sinking.
Yeah, and then everything drains out, and
Yep. The next part of the chapter is called From the Disembarkation to the Exodus. That white bull, who had become a man, came out of that vessel, and the 3 bulls with him. And one of those 3 bulls was white like that bull, and one of them was red like blood, and one of them was black.
All right, so let's talk about these. As the allegory continues, Abraham sires both a white bull calf, Isaac, and a wild donkey. That's Ishmael. But Isaac turns out to be the last bull. He sires a black boar, Esau, and a white sheep, Jacob, who in turn engenders 12 white sheep, and so a new set of symbols is introduced. I think we went. Yeah.
Well, we'll get into
Okay.
a bunch of them.
Sure.
And that white bull departed from them, and they began to beget wild beasts and birds, so that there arose from them every kind of species: lions, leopards, wolves, dogs, hyenas, wild boars, foxes, conies, pigs, falcons, vultures, kites, eagles, and ravens. The identity of these species of birds is uncertain, from a footnote. But among them a white bull was born, and they began to bite one another. But that white bull that was born among them begot a wild ass and a white bull with it, and the wild asses increased. But that bull was born from it begat a black wild boar and a white ram of the flock, and that wild boar begot many boars, and that ram begat 12 sheep. When those 12 sheep,
Obviously, talking about, Jacob and the tribes of Israel.
yes, when those 12 sheep had grown up, they handed over one of themselves to the wild asses, and those wild asses in turn handed that sheep over to the wolves, and that sheep grew up among the wolves. And the ram led forth the 11 sheep to dwell with it and to pasture with it among the wolves.
And just to be clear, this is about when Joseph goes to Egypt.
Yes. And they multiplied and became many flocks of sheep. And the wolves began to fear them and oppress them until they did away with their young, and they cast their young into a river of much water. And those sheep began to cry out because of their young, and to make complaint to their Lord. And a sheep that had escaped safely from the wolves fled and went off to the wild asses. And I saw the sheep groaning and crying out and petitioning their Lord with all their might, until that Lord of sheep descended from a lofty chamber at the voice of the sheep, and he came to them and saw them.
So if you've noticed, it went from bulls, in the more primordial stuff. So now since it's getting, closer to, the time of the kings, the shift from bulls to sheep cannot be explained as the author's way of distinguishing Jews from Gentiles, because Abraham and Isaac have already been pictured as white bulls among the wild beasts. Moreover, the fact that a messianic white bull appears again near the end of the allegory proves that the bovine species has not been dropped, but rather suspended. Most likely the allegorist is thinking of the mysterious change in identity from Jacob to Israel. Maybe.
And is this part about Moses?
Well, we're
The part we're on now.
We're getting to...
I feel like it is.
Yeah.
Anywho,
They're
please continue.
talking about the firstborn Egyptians,
okay. Yeah.
Jewish Egyptians, right? The boys were being drowned, right? And then Moses was put in a basket.
Yeah.
Okay, so they meet the Lord of sheep. And he summoned that sheep that had fled from the wolves, and he spoke to it about the wolves, that it should testify against them not to touch the sheep. And the sheep went to the wolves at the command of the Lord, and another sheep met that sheep and went with it. So here's Aaron. And the two of them went and entered together into the assembly of these wolves, the Egyptians. And they spoke to them and testified against them that they should not henceforth touch the sheep. After this, I saw the wolves.
Let my sheep go.
Bah. After this, I saw the wolves, how they dealt more harshly with the sheep with all their might, and how the sheep cried out. And their Lord came to the sheep and began to strike the wolves. And the wolves began to lament, but the sheep were quiet, and thereafter they did not cry out. And I looked at the sheep until they went out from the wolves, and the wolves' eyes were blinded, and the wolves went out pursuing those sheep with all their might. And the Lord of the sheep went with them, leading them, and all his sheep followed him. That they did. And his face was dazzling and glorious and fearful to look at.
Yeah, so if you remember when he went to go talk to God, and he came back, his face was radiant. Some translations,
Moses.
Some translations say that he grew horns. Also,
I think they're referencing
Like a ram.
like Yahweh, not Moses,
Oh.
in this sentence.
are they okay?
Yeah, ditto, I have to agree with that.
Which would be strange because, outright it says that the Lord of the sheep went with them, right? I don't remember in Exodus God physically being there. Now, there were pillars, right?
Or maybe he was just with them in spirit.
Well, apparently they can see his face, which is dazzling and glorious and
Sure.
fearful to look at.
So like a mountain.
Yeah.
Face of the mountain.
And the wolves began to pursue those sheep until they met them by a swamp of water. And that swamp of water was split apart, and the water stood to one side and the other before them. And their Lord, as he led them, stood between them and the wolves. And those wolves did not see the sheep. They went into the midst of that swamp of water. The wolves pursued the sheep, and those wolves ran after them into that swamp of water. And when they saw the Lord of the sheep, they turned to flee from his presence. But that swamp of water flowed together and suddenly returned to its natural state. And the water swelled up and rose until it covered those wolves. And I saw until all the wolves that had pursued those sheep perished and sank.
Got him again.
Which is also in conflict with the Exodus narrative, because the Egyptians never run into Yahweh in the middle of the sea.
Sure,
and
yeah,
then
yeah,
turn
yeah.
around and
It's
try to
allegory
run
of allegory. Don't worry.
But, working through Moses, I guess you could say that he did.
Not even, because the Egyptians never turned tail and tried to run away in the Exodus story.
I mean, yeah, they just died.
Yeah, they just died.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are wolves. They're different.
From Exodus to Moses' death. But the sheep departed from that water and went out to a desert where there was no water or grass, and they began to open their eyes and see. And I saw until, there's a footnote, conjunction supplied, a cliche in this vision. And I saw until the Lord of the sheep was pasturing them and giving them water and grass, and that sheep was going and leading them. That sheep went up to the summit of a high rock, and the Lord of the sheep sent it to them. And after that I saw the Lord of the sheep who stood before them, and his appearance was majestic and fearful and mighty. And all those sheep saw him and were afraid before him. And all of them were afraid and trembling because of him. And they were crying out, after that sheep, with the other sheep that was in their midst, we cannot stand before our Lord or look at him. And again, that sheep that led them went up to the summit of that rock, and the sheep began to be blinded and to stray from the path that it had shown them. But the sheep did not know about these things. And the Lord of that sheep was filled with great wrath against them. And that sheep discovered it and went down from the summit of that rock and came to the sheep and found most of them blinded and straying.
Yeah, so obviously you're talking about the golden calf.
Right.
And it's just interesting because in the biblical narrative, God was just not around, but now
Now
in
he's
this narrative,
like
when
there.
now when they see him and can presumably in some way interact with him, they're at least describing him, kind of trying to.
I mean, they
Sorry.
look at him.
Yeah. So it just seems weird in this narrative why they would do such a thing. I guess they're saying that they just didn't know it was wrong.
Mhm. And when they saw it, they were afraid and trembled before it and wished to return to their folds. And that sheep took other sheep with it and went against those sheep that had strayed and began to slaughter them. And the sheep were afraid of it. And that sheep returned.
That's my favorite part
Yeah.
of the golden calf narrative.
Yeah. And that sheep returned all the straying flock to their folds. And I saw in this vision until that sheep became a man and built a house for the Lord of the sheep and made all the sheep stand in that house. This is the tabernacle.
Yes.
And I saw until that sheep that had met that sheep that had led them fell asleep. And I saw until all the large sheep perished, and little ones rose in their place, and they came to a pasture and approached a river of water. And that sheep that had led them, that had become a man, was separated from them and fell asleep. And all the sheep searched for him and cried bitterly because of him.
I don't remember anyone searching for him.
No, I don't.
Where'd he
remember.
go?
No, he just went up to a mountain and died.
Yeah.
I guess he's gone. Whatever.
From the entrance into the land to the building of the temple. And I saw until they ceased crying for that sheep and crossed that stream of water. And
Jordan River.
Yep. The Ethiopic version is corrupt, where it says two. And 2 sheep arose that led them instead of those that had fallen asleep.
So that was...
And they led them.
Yeah, so that was Joshua.
Yeah.
And then who's the other guy? We barely learned about him, but I remember that there was some other guy who made it into Israel.
I don't remember. He got...
like a couple...
He got a reward, I remember.
Yeah, was it Caleb?
Was it Caleb? I think it was Caleb.
I feel like it was Caleb,
Yeah.
but I don't remember exactly.
I
Not
also
100%.
don't recall.
I'm pretty sure it was Caleb. Let's go with Caleb.
I'll Google it.
If it's not Caleb, then that's on you.
Sure. Or I can just look at one of these Bibles.
Yeah, you can easily. And I saw the sheep until they were entering a good place and a pleasant and glorious land. And I saw those sheep until they were satisfied, and that house was in their midst in the pleasant land. And sometimes their eyes were opened, and sometimes they were blinded, until another sheep arose and led them and brought them all back, and their eyes were opened. And the dogs began to devour the sheep, and the wild boars and the foxes were devouring them, until the Lord of the sheep raised up a ram from among the sheep which led them. This translation follows mainly Greek fragments against the corrupt Ethiopic. And this ram began to butt and pursue with its horns. And it hurled itself against the foxes, and after them against the wild boars. And it destroyed many wild boars. And after them it struck the dogs. And the sheep whose eyes were open saw the ram among the sheep until it forsook its path and began to walk where there was no path. And the Lord of the sheep sent this sheep to another sheep to appoint it to be a ram.
You know, which one do you think is better? This version of the story or the biblical one?
Oh, this version of the story, definitely.
It's way shorter.
It's definitely shorter. But, okay, so on one hand, yeah, this doesn't have all the monotonous stuff about the tabernacle. But also, when they consistently say this sheep met another sheep to go meet that sheep, it gets a little confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah, which sheep is which?
To appoint the sheep to be a ram, to rule the sheep instead of the ram that had forsaken its way. And it went to it and spoke with it secretly alone and appointed it to be a ram and ruler and leader of the sheep. And during all these things, the dogs were oppressing the sheep. And the first ram pursued the second ram, and the second ram arose and fled before it. Then I looked at the first ram until it fell before the dogs. And the second ram arose and led the sheep. And the sheep grew and multiplied, and all the dogs and foxes fled from it. And
So
feared it.
now we're talking about Saul, right?
Mm-hmm.
And is it David coming up next, or do you think they're including Samuel?
Well, the next subsection is the apostasy of the two kingdoms, which
Okay.
and then
So that
it
could go
goes
either way.
into the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah, we did talk about this last stream a little, where a lot of these could go either way.
Yeah. But this is after Exodus.
Well,
This
let's
is-
continue. Maybe
I think
we'll-
this is like in the time of Judges, maybe.
I think this would be in Samuel, because I think one of these is supposed to be Saul for sure.
The one that gets turned into a ram, that's appointed to be the ruler.
Well, Right, because he was the one that was king first.
Mm.
So I think that would make sense.
Okay. During all these
Because
things,
you're right. Remember, Samuel was like, you guys won't want a king, but you know, if you guys keep asking for one, here you go.
Yeah. The dogs were oppressing the sheep, and the first ram pursued the second ram, and the second ram arose and fled before it. Then I looked at the first ram until it fell before the dogs. And the second ram arose and led the sheep, and the sheep grew and multiplied, and all the dogs and foxes fled from it and feared it. And that ram butted and killed all the beasts, and those beasts did not prevail again among the sheep, nor did they snatch anything at all away from them. And that ram begot many sheep, and it fell asleep, and a little sheep became ram instead of it, and it became the ruler and leader of these sheep. And that house became larger and broad, and a large and high tower was built upon that house for the Lord of the sheep. So this little
this
sheep
house
that becomes a ram is Solomon.
Yes.
Okay. That house was low, but the tower was raised up and was high. And the Lord of the sheep stood on that tower, and they spread a full table before him.
That's all. That's all it gets. By the way, that's the only mention of this that we get.
The apostasy. The what?
Okay, actually, if you go back to because we were talking about Judges earlier, if you go back to 89:41, the entire period of the Judges is covered in that single verse.
Wow!
Thank
you for summarizing that.
Sometimes their eyes were open, and sometimes they were blinded. Okay. Great. Good job. The apostasy of the two kingdoms. This is Israel and Judah.
Yeah.
And again, I saw that those sheep strayed and went off in many paths and abandoned that house of theirs. And the Lord of the sheep summoned some from among the sheep and sent them to the sheep, and the sheep began to kill them.
That was a confusing sentence.
That was the greatest. You know, no rephrasing necessary. Wonderfully written.
So the sheep sent to the other sheep. So either Israel or Judah sent to Israel or Judah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just go on.
That sounds like the worst setup for a joke.
Yeah.
The punchline better be damn good, because if you're using interchangeable characters, they must not be very important.
But one of them escaped safely and was not killed. It sprang away and cried out over the sheep, and they wished to kill it. But the Lord of the sheep saved it from the hands of the sheep and brought it up to me and made it to dwell there. And many other sheep he sent to those sheep to testify and lament over them. So what is he referencing there?
I am not 100% sure. What verse is that again?
52.
That was 52. Okay. Okay, it was the translation of Elijah is mentioned, and he is brought up to stay with Enoch. Yeah.
Because I thought
I'm
it might be
talking off
Elijah,
screen.
but
Thank you for asking.
But they didn't really go into anything about Elijah.
Yeah, nothing really. But, you know, prophets, important.
Yeah.
So you talk about them.
After that, I saw when they abandoned the house of the Lord and his tower, they went astray in everything, and their eyes were blinded. And I saw that the Lord of the sheep worked much slaughter on them and their pastures, because those sheep invited that slaughter and betrayed his place. And he abandoned them into the hands of the lions and the leopards and the wolves and the hyenas, and into the hands of the foxes and into all the beasts. And those wild beasts began to tear those sheep in pieces. And I saw that he abandoned that house of theirs and their tower, and he threw them all into the hands of the lions, so that they might tear them in pieces and devour them.
Yeah, so this is actually about both the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests.
Yes. And I began to cry out with all my might, and to call the Lord of the sheep, and to show him concerning the sheep, because they were devoured by all the wild beasts. And he was silent, though he saw it. And he rejoiced because they were devoured and swallowed up and carried off, and he abandoned them into the hands of all the beasts as fodder. Great. From the destruction of Jerusalem to the end time, the commissioning of the 70 shepherds and the angelic scribe. And he summoned 70 shepherds, and he left those sheep to them, that they might pasture them. And he said to the shepherds and their subordinates, every one of you from now on shall pasture the sheep, and everything that I command you do. I am handing them over to you duly numbered, and I will tell you which of them are to be destroyed. Destroy them. And he handed those sheep over to them. And another one he summoned and said to him, observe and see everything that the shepherds do against these sheep, for they will destroy more of them than I have commanded them. Every excess and destruction that is done by the shepherds write down, how many they destroy at my command and how many they destroy on their own. Every destruction by each individual shepherd write down against them. And by number read them in my presence, how many they destroy and how many they hand over to destruction, so that I may have this testimony against them, that I may know every deed of the shepherds, that I may measure them and see what they are doing, whether they are acting according to the command that I gave them or not. And do not let them know it, and do not show them or rebuke them, but write down every destruction by the shepherds one by one in his own time, and bring it all up to me.
So these shepherds are obviously just going to be rulers and kings. And what I find interesting is that the Lord of the sheep, Yahweh, is handing them over, even when he himself has acknowledged that that they're going to kill more than he wants them to. Which is like, bad idea, man.
Yeah.
Like
Terrible
you just
idea.
said.
Specify harder.
And apparently he can't figure out what they're doing unless he has people gathering data for him,
Yeah.
which is strange.
Yeah.
The first period, the 12 shepherds until the exile. And I saw until those shepherds were pasturing each in his time, and they began to kill and destroy many more than they had been commanded. And they abandoned those sheep into the hands of the lions. And the lions and leopards devoured and swallowed up most of those sheep, and the wild boars devoured along with them, and they burnt down that tower and demolished that house. And I grieved exceedingly over that tower, and because that house of the sheep had been demolished. And from then on I was unable to see whether those sheep were going into that house. And the shepherds and their subordinates handed over those sheep to all the wild beasts to devour them.
So a little bit more on the shepherds. I don't think we've gotten to the part where it says for how long they're each going to rule. Have we?
I did not see anything like that.
Anything about them? Okay, so I'm just gonna jump to this because I want to talk about the shepherds themselves.
Okay.
So yeah, the Lord of the sheep summons 70 shepherds and turns the care of the sheep over to them. They are to shepherd the flock one at a time for a single hour each. Did you get to the hour part? I didn't hear it if you did.
I didn't remember that.
All right. Well, anyways, so these shepherds may be an adaptation of the traditional 70 guardian angels of each of the 70 Gentile nations. You can cross-reference the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, which totals 70, and Daniel 10:13 and 21 through 22. I think that's probably also in Daniel. That's in Daniel 10, yeah. Which implies that each nation has its angel. But if so, this spatial image has been freely turned into a temporal one, probably inspired by Jeremiah's division of the exile into 70 periods. That's Jeremiah 25:11. Periodization of history based on jubilees, 49 years, or sevens and 70s, is a common feature in intertestamental literature. The author of the Animal Apocalypse thinks in terms of 4 empires ruling Palestine from the time of the exile, Babylonian, Persian, Greek Ptolemaic, and Greek Seleucid. The periods of the 70 shepherd angels are likewise divided into 4 segments of 12, 23, 23, and 12 hours. We'll get into that a little bit more. If 1 hour equals 7 years, the numbers actually do come out about right for these 4 empires in real history, but only if one assumes hours of 3.5 years for the last period, a temporal device used by the Dream Visions author's apocalyptic commentary, the final redactor of Daniel. And that's in Daniel 12:7. We're going to get into it a little bit more in the next section of First Enoch, but we're going to talk about the apocalypse of weeks. Then once we get to Daniel, we're going to talk about, that apocalyptic timetable in there. So apocalypticism is very, very interesting, but when it comes to these apocalyptic calendars, they can also be very complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Where was I? We're still talking about these 12 shepherds. Okay.
Yeah.
And the shepherds and their subordinates handed over each of these sheep to the wild beasts to devour them. And each of them individually in his time was given over by number, and by number each of them handed over to his companion. In a book it was written how many of...
I bet I know which book that was.
Is it the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel
and Judah?
Yes.
Yeah,
you got
it
it.
is. We did.
Amazing.
Are we counting that as in it was written?
No,
we are
not.
not.
We don't even do
this
that. This is
on
a
this
different show.
Come on.
In a book it was written how many of them he was destroying. And more than was prescribed for them, each of them was killing and destroying, and I began to weep and lament because of those sheep. And thus in the vision I saw how that one who was writing down each one that was being destroyed by those shepherds every day, and how he was bringing up and spreading out and showing that whole book to the Lord of the sheep, everything that they had done and everything that each one of them had taken away and everything that they had handed over to destruction. And the book was read in the presence of the Lord of the sheep, and he took the book from his hand and read it and set it down. And I saw until the shepherds were pasturing for 12 hours.
Yeah, so there we are with the hours, yeah.
Yeah. Then it goes into the second period, the 23 shepherds from the return to Alexander. And look, Alexander.
I mean, Alexander the Great, I'm guessing.
I
mean, because it would,
so.
Yeah, it would make sense with the time this was written.
Yeah, but that's odd.
I mean, he was, very important.
No, in Atheist Sunday School, we haven't run into any mention of Alexander.
Well, yeah, we wouldn't have because we're not there yet.
We're gonna feel like it's distinctly different in what it will be willing to reference even.
Well,
think about that. They totally would decontextualize all sorts of stuff if they didn't think it was relevant.
The thing is, it wouldn't be like they mentioned Cyrus in the Bible, right? So you definitely could mention Alexander in there too. That wouldn't be like a bad thing.
Yeah.
So the issue is that for all the texts that we have read so far in the Bible,
they are
pre-Alexander.
Pre-Alexander.
Yeah.
But I don't think I've ever heard you mention a biblical reference to Alexander the Great.
I mean, there's definitely some stuff. I think there's some stuff about him in Daniel, but I think that because I don't remember it right, but I think that might be at least like a reference to, but not strictly. It says Alexander.
Oh, this one says Alexander.
What's that guy's name? Delling Coley. Is that what it is?
Conley?
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, he agrees.
Always agree with nihilism. Thank you.
And look, 3 of those sheep returned and came and entered and began to build all that had fallen down from that house. And the wild boars tried to hinder them, but they could not. And they began to build as before, and they raised up that tower. It was called the High Tower. And they began to again to place a table before the tower, but all the bread on it was polluted and not pure. And besides all these things, the eyes of the sheep were blind, and they did not see, and their shepherds likewise. And they handed them over to the wild beasts for greater destruction. And they trampled the sheep with their feet and devoured them. And the Lord of the sheep remained silent until all the sheep were scattered over the field and were mixed with them and did not save them from the hand of the beasts.
Mixed with them? Oh, man.
You're supposed to do that.
You're not, no, that's so bad. Did you read Ezra? Did you read Nehemiah? That's bad, guys.
And this one who was writing the book brought it up and showed it and read it in the houses of the Lord of the sheep. And he interceded with him in their behalf and petitioned him in their behalf, showing him every deed of the shepherds, and he testified in his presence against all the shepherds. And he took the book and set it down by him and went out. And I saw until the time when 35 shepherds had been pasturing in this manner, and they all completed their respective times like the first ones. And others received them into their hands to pasture them, and in their respective times each shepherd in his time. The third period, the 23 shepherds from Alexander into the 2nd century. After this, in my vision, I saw all the birds of heaven come, eagles and vultures. Oh, wait, this is chapter 90.
Oh, it's chapter 90.
You know what?
Great.
It's just weirdly broken up. Chapter 90 was the last verse.
Ah, okay.
But
Gotcha.
here, why don't we trade off? You can read from now on.
I'll read it. There's a little bit on there about the dating of this section, which I found really interesting.
All right.
I think it should be
in 90 is okay.
Yeah, so if you want to read something about the date.
Why don't I go over that then?
Yeah.
The beginning of the 4th period brings us to the real author's own day and the early stages of the Maccabean revolt. The passage dates the allegory. Why don't you
Get to that passage?
Get through verse 12, and then I'll...
Okay, gotcha. Did you read through verse 2? Or are you halfway through?
No, just the first one.
Okay. After this, in my vision, I saw all the birds of heaven come, eagles and vultures and kites and ravens, and the eagles were leading all the birds, and they began to devour those sheep and peck out their eyes and devour their flesh. And the sheep cried out because their flesh was being devoured by the birds. And I cried out and lamented in my sleep because of that shepherd who was pasturing the sheep. And I saw until those sheep were devoured by the dogs and by the eagles and by the kites. And they left them neither flesh nor skin nor sinew, until only their bones remained. And their bones fell on the earth, and the sheep became few. And I saw until the time that 23 shepherds had been pasturing, that they completed in their respective times 58 times. The 4th period, the 12 shepherds until the end time.
Yeah.
And look.
The 3rd period, they were like talking about the 2nd temple period.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
And look, lambs were born of those white sheep. And they began to open their eyes and to see and to cry out to the sheep. But they did not listen to them, nor attend to their words. But they were extremely deaf. Not just deaf, they were extremely deaf.
Huh?
What?
Like,
Where am I?
extreme.
And their eyes were extremely and excessively blinded. And I saw in the vision that the ravens flew upon those lambs and seized one of those lambs and dashed the sheep into pieces and devoured them. And I saw until horns came out on those lambs, and the ravens were casting down on their horns. And this part's bracketed off. Let's see, which one is this? So these verses that I'm about to read, which describe the activity of Judas Maccabeus, appear to be a doublet of verses 6 through 9.
Yeah.
11, 17, 9. If so, they are an update of a slightly earlier apocalypse, interpolated around 163 to 161 BCE.
Mm.
All right, did you say you have a note on that?
There's a bit about doublets later on.
Okay, I'll get through this, though. And I saw until a great horn sprouted on one of those sheep, and it looked on them, and their eyes were opened, and it cried out to the sheep, and the rams saw it, and they all ran to it. And that's the end of the bracket there. Oh, this is actually a different one. I actually read the commentary for a different one, I think.
Wonderful.
Did I? No. Oh, sorry. No.
What verse?
Never mind. That was verse 10. No, it's split. This interpolation is split into two.
Oh.
That's why. Okay.
Okay.
And besides this, all those eagles and vultures and ravens and kites were still tearing the sheep in pieces and flying upon them and devouring them. And the sheep were silent, but the rams lamented and cried out. And then it continues, the interpolation, yeah.
After the end of verse 12.
Okay. And those ravens were struggling and fighting with it and wished to do away with its horn, but they did not prevail against it.
Okay. Judas Maccabee. This passage dates the allegory. Judas's ascendancy to leadership of the revolt is described 165 BC, but not his death 160 BC. Note that the ravens did not prevail against him. The younger generations of the reformers mentioned here, the lamb who tried to rouse the blinded sheep, is probably the group from which the author most identified. And they may be the Hasidim mentioned in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. If the 70 weeks...
Which, by the way, 1st and 2nd Maccabees,
yes.
After we are done with the first book of Enoch, we are going to cover...
Yep.
Yeah, according to the vote. We're going to be covering 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and I have ordered... I'm going to tell a little story here.
Yep.
So I ordered two commentaries from the Anchor commentary series. I ordered, one commentary on 1st Maccabees, the other one on 2nd. And on Amazon, the order that came in a couple days ago was supposed to be the commentary on 2nd Maccabees. Instead, it was a commentary on 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It's like, I don't need this now, and it smelled like shampoo.
Yeah.
It definitely.
Yeah. So that was kind of a bummer. But anyways, since we're going to be starting 1st and 2nd Maccabees soon.
$7 profit.
Yes. $7 profit. We have a wish list, and on that wish list, you can get some more commentaries if you want to learn more stuff about Maccabees.
Yeah, if you check us out on our Amazon wish list, you will definitely see some Maccabees-related materials there.
Yes.
Oh, it was a bathroom book. That makes more sense.
That would make sense, yeah.
If
Fuck
the
Chronicles.
70 weeks of years scheme conforms to real history as previously suggested, with foreshortened weeks in the last period, and if the date of the animal apocalypse is 160, then the author sees himself as writing at the onset of the 70th week. And we pass after these verses from Vaticanica ex eventu into genuine prophecy.
Yeah, ex eventu is like an after the fact kind of
Okay.
prophecy. Yeah.
Okay.
Like for anyone that's just confused, it's like if like Ruben, if you did something yesterday
Mhm.
and then I wrote about you doing that thing today, but I pretended like it was a prophecy about a future event, like that would be me putting myself back in time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what Ex Eventu is.
All right. I've got some commentary after you get done with verse 18.
Okay. Verse 13. And I saw until the shepherds and the eagles and those vultures and the kites came, and they carried to the ravens to smash the horn of that ram. And they struggled and made war with it. And it was struggling with them and cried out that its help might come. And I looked until that man came who wrote the names of the shepherds and brought them before the Lord of the sheep. And he helped it and showed it everything. His help came down to that ram. And I saw until the Lord of the sheep came upon them in wrath. And all that I saw him, this is a weird sentence. And all that's, oh, there we go. And all that saw him fled, and all fell into darkness before him. And all the eagles and vultures and ravens and kites gathered and brought with them all the wild beasts. And apparently there's a note here, amended from wild sheep, which have not been previously mentioned.
Yes.
And they all came together and helped one another smash the horn of that ram. And I looked at that man who wrote the book at the word of the Lord until he opened the book of the destruction that those last 12 shepherds worked. And he showed before the Lord of the sheep that they had destroyed more than those before him. It's like you already knew that. And I saw until the Lord of the sheep came to them and took in his hand the staff of his wrath and struck the earth, and the earth was split, and all the beasts and all the birds of heaven fell away from among those sheep and sank in the earth, and it covered over them. I'm just going to finish this last verse. Verse 19. And I saw until a large sword was given to those sheep, and the sheep went out against all the wild beasts to kill them, and all the beasts and the birds of heaven fled before them.
Eerdmans says these verses describe in two parallel passages the final assault on the sheep by the predatory birds. Comparing the doublets, it seems likely that the original allegory, 90:16 through 18, was updated shortly after its composition, verses 13 through 15, to include late-breaking developments in the Maccabean conflict. The unexpected victories at Beth Zur, early 164, and at Karnaim, mid-163, during which battle visions of an angel and of God himself were reported, which we'll get into in Maccabees. Like the author of the Qumran War Scroll, this author expected God and his angels to personally join the fray at the last battle, and finally turn the tide against the Gentile aggressors. Here God indeed appears and routs the enemies, and he gives a special sword to the sheep so that they may assist in the defeat. The way is now prepared for the last judgment.
And you know what? That's this next part. The judgment and the new age. And I saw until a throne was constructed in the pleasant land, and the Lord of the sheep sat upon it. And he took all the sealed books, and opened those books before the Lord of the sheep. And the Lord summoned those first 7 white men, angels, the ones that we talked about before, and he commanded them to, this kind of brings into question here. So it's a reference to these 7 white men, which I'm guessing are angels, the archangels that we covered.
Yeah, because there was 4 archangels in one list, but there were
exactly.
more archangels in a previous list.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I just want to put a little pin in that. And he commanded them to bring before him, beginning with the first star that had preceded those stars, whose organs were like the organs of horses.
Whose private parts were like those of horses.
Oh, yeah. And then there's a footnote here. A few evidently superfluous words have been dropped here. We don't have the commentary on that, sadly.
It's big.
And they
Superfluous, my ass. That's required.
and they brought all of them before him. And he said to the man who had been... said to the man who was running the stand, "Hey,
No, not that.
got any grapes?"
I hate that. You know, I'm pretty sure a friend of ours knew the guy that made that.
That sucks.
Yeah.
And he said to the man who had been writing before him, who was one of those 7 white ones, he said to him, "Bring those 70 shepherds to whom I delivered the sheep, and who took and killed more than I commanded them. And look, I saw all of them bound, and they all stood before them. And judgment was exacted first on the stars, and they were judged and found to be sinners. And they went to the place of judgment, and they threw them into an abyss, and it was full of fire, and it was burning, and it was full of pillars of fire." And that is not the same description that we got before.
Right.
Less fire in the first description,
Mm-hmm.
just very dark holes. One of them was bright, I guess.
Yeah.
And those 70 shepherds were judged and found to be sinners, and they were thrown into that fiery abyss. And I saw at that time that an abyss like it was opened in the middle of the earth, which was full of fire. And they brought those blinded sheep, and they were all judged and found to be sinners. And they were thrown into that fiery abyss, and they burned. And that abyss was to the south of that house. And I saw those sheep burning, and their bones burning. Everybody dies.
Yeah. Many scholars have suspected influence from this scene on the parable of the sheep and goats in Matthew 25. Enoch here actually sees in a vision the judgment described to him as a future event in the Book of the Watchers. Enoch chapter 27.
Right. Yeah, but we already went over that.
Right.
So what did you say some people think an influence was? Matthew 25?
The parable of the sheep and goats in Matthew 25.
Okay, so yeah, that's quite a lot of stuff there. Oh, we'll get to it eventually.
Yeah,
I was hoping it'd be short.
On Atheist Sunday School.
We will.
Eventually.
Yeah, we'll get there. And I stood up to see until that old house was folded up, and they removed all the pillars, and all the beams and ornaments of that house were folded up with it, and they removed it and put it in a place to the south of the land. And I saw until the Lord of the sheep brought a new house, larger and higher than the first one, and he erected it on the site of the first one that had been rolled up. And all its pillars were new, and its beams were new, and its ornaments were new, and larger than those of the first one, the old one that had been removed. And all the sheep were within it. And I saw all the sheep that remained, and all the animals on the earth, and all the birds of heaven were falling down and worshiping those sheep, and making petition to them, and obeying them in everything. So this is, this new period where the Jews are ruling things.
Yeah.
They win. And everyone's worshiping, I guess.
Yep. Well, I mean, that's not good, right? God's not going to be happy about that.
About
right?
Gentiles
Gentiles worshiping Jews.
anyways, after that, those three who were clothed in white, and who had taken hold of me by my hand, who had previously brought me up with the hand of that ram also taking hold of me, set me down among those sheep before the judgment took place. So this is Enoch and those 4 angels?
Eerdmans says, they lifted me up and set me down in the midst of those sheep who were free of condemnation.
Okay, so that is quite different.
Yes.
Before the judgment took place, yeah. So at least according to this translation, Enoch's going to be there for the judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And all those sheep were white, and their wool was thick and pure. And all that had been destroyed and dispersed by all the wild beasts and all the birds of heaven were gathered in that house. And the Lord of the sheep rejoiced greatly, because they were all good and had returned to that house. And I saw, until they laid down that sword that had been given to the sheep, they brought it back to his house and sealed it up in the presence of the Lord. And all the sheep were enclosed in that house, but it did not contain them. And the eyes of all were opened, and they saw good things, and there was none among them that did not see. And I saw how that house was large and broad and very full. So it really seems to me like God could have done this earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Has revealed himself to everybody, this
Yeah.
this profound truth.
I
Well,
mean,
that
he
would
did.
really-
And when he did that, people were just scared shitless and decided to blindfold themselves.
It was like Bird Box or whatever that movie
Yeah.
was. Yeah. I never saw it, but something about being blindfolded and can't be looking at something.
Yeah, but that's that was, that's what happens when God shows up. People blindfold themselves because they're too scared of him.
Yeah, that's impressive. And I saw how a white bull was born, and its horns were large, and all the wild beasts and all the birds of heaven were afraid of it, and made petition to it continually. And I saw until all their species were changed, and they all became white cattle. And the first one became leader among them, and that leader was a large mammal, and there were large black horns on its head.
Instead of leader, Eerdman says Nagar.
Oh, yeah, there is a note on there, I think, either on this page or the next one. But there is a note about that translation.
Nagar is a mistranslation. Okay.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, and here's actually something different. So on that word there's a note here. It says text reads word instead of leader, a major crux of interpretation. And then he suggests, the commentary that we don't have. We have the second one.
Oof.
Yeah, bummer, whatever. And there were large black horns on its head, and the Lord of the sheep rejoiced over it and over all the cattle. And I slept among them and awoke, and I saw everything. And this is the vision that I saw while I slept. And I awoke and blessed the Lord of righteousness and gave him glory.
Hold up. All right, I'm going to read a bit out of Eerdman's here.
Go ahead,
yeah.
buddy.
A great many of the details found here will eventually make their way into Christian eschatology. God himself builds the new Jerusalem to replace the old, and there is no temple in the new city.
Yeah, and the new Jerusalem is more of like a heaven on earth kind of thing, at least in Revelation.
We learn that Enoch and Elijah returned to the city during
New
these
Earth,
end
too.
times. A tradition that will live on Christian expectation, beginning already with 2 witnesses of Revelation 11:3-12, which have consistently interpreted by Christian writers as Elijah and Enoch since the earliest times. Remarkably, after these events, a white bull is born, often interpreted as a Messiah figure. He is perhaps to be seen in continuity with the unbroken string of white bulls from Adam to Isaac, the real heir to the original line. His only task is somehow to act as a catalyst whereby all animals become white bulls, thus eliminating not only sinful or secondary status among Jews, no black or red bulls are in sight, but even the distinction between Jew and Gentile. The sheep/wild animal phase of the allegory is finished. With the wild animals, with the elimination of both national distinctions and of evil in general, humanity returns to Eden. At this point, the text is corrupt, where they're talking about Nagar, and then they go on to say wild ox and lamb are among the more plausible suggestions. If lamb is right, then Messiah may be understood as an idealized human figure who nevertheless sprang from Jewish stock before his exaltation as a beast above all other animals. But the interpretation must be tentative. The Dream Visions concludes with...
Yeah, I'll read this off here. And I awoke and blessed the Lord of righteousness and gave him glory. And after that I wept bitterly, and my tears did not cease until I could no longer endure it. But they were running down because of what I had seen. For everything will come to pass and be fulfilled. And every deed of humanity was shown to me in its order. Not really. That night I remembered the first dream. I wept because of it, and I was disturbed because I had seen the vision. And that's the end of it.
Yep, that's the end of the Dream Visions. You know, interestingly enough, it's not Christian at all.
We'll definitely know it's, before there was a Christianity.
Right, and I don't see how a Christian could interpret the...
Well, no, here's why I can help you out here. So, because all the early Christians, they were Jews.
Yeah.
They were Jewish Christians.
So it's just like, oh, well, Jesus is one of the implied lambs.
Or Jesus is that final lamb. He's the leader. That one.
Right, but that doesn't get introduced until...
Yeah, way later.
After
exactly.
judgment.
They're reading into it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the author of this would not have known that.
Right.
Yeah. He probably had something else in mind.
Yeah.
Or it was just, a generic kind of Messiah expectation, which there was.
You think that...
Which is why, Jesus and other apocalyptic preachers were so popular during the time, because the Jews did have an expectation for a Messiah.
I think that probably contributes to why it was not in Christian canons.
Not according to Zara Yaakov.
What about Zara Yaakov?
Well, he thought it should be in there.
Well, obviously, how else are you going to know anything?
Anything, yeah, exactly.
Necessary.
How are you going to know how the sky works?
Yeah.
Anyways, so what'd you think of the Dream Visions?
Well, the Dream Visions...
Bizarre.
They were bizarre. I'll say that it was way better than reading the Torah.
Yeah, I think it was better than the astronomical book, too.
Yeah, it was better than the astronomical
And I
book.
thought the astronomical book would be cool, but the Book of the Watchers...
Book of
has
the
been
Watchers
the
were
best
right.
one.
Yeah.
I like that one the most still.
The Animal Apocalypse would make a good, animated short.
I feel like it'd make, because I could see, the Animal Apocalypse is like the Bible Animal Farm version.
Yeah.
So you could do some strikingly good commentary.
Yeah.
Anyways, so since that was the end of that, we have one more book to cover.
One more book in the Book of Enoch.
Yeah, that's
the first book of Enoch.
Yeah. So we have coming up after this the Epistle of Enoch.
Well, there's also a little.
It just says a narrative bridge. It's really not that much.
There's a narrative bridge.
Yeah. But after that, we're gonna get into the Epistle of Enoch, and it's not too long, but and all the chapters are pretty short. I mean, the chapters today were just really long.
Yeah.
So
Probably the longest in the book.
yeah, chapter wise, definitely. Anyways, so since that's the end of it, I would like to remind everybody to drop a like if you haven't. I want you to subscribe.
And we're getting
great.
towards the end of the month.
Yes.
Which, you know what that means.
That means
You've got 1 week left.
1 week left to use the promo code LOOK
Look, LOOK, all caps.
to get 10% off on everything on
In
our
our
Teespring.
Teespring.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, just everything in general.
No, not everything in general. Just on our
Teespring. Sadly.
Sadly, we don't have those kinds of connections.
We also have Patreon, and
Yes.
on Patreon, once we hit our $200 donation goal, we're gonna be making a fantastic show. I think the High Place. It's gonna be great.
It's going to be amazing.
Yeah.
And if you would like to support that,
There's that.
yeah,
You got a lot of cool rewards. You could be on this show. You could be on Atheist Sunday School. You could do a lot of stuff.
yeah, you can read the Bible with us.
Yeah. So it's always
Or
a good bit of fun.
apocryphal stuff.
Or that too, yeah.
Yep.
Uh,
Now, we're going to be starting
go watch the
First
Council of Constantinople video.
First and Second Maccabees.
Yes.
After this last book of Enoch.
Yeah.
And then after that,
I'm gonna have to look back at the poll.
mhm,
Maybe Jubilees.
maybe Jubilees, maybe the Tobit,
Yeah, maybe Tobit. Yeah.
maybe Second Enoch
Nah.
or
There was
Third
something that was
Enoch.
in second place pretty distinctly. I can check.
Yeah. And Maccabees that was pretty important.
And it's long,
Yes, thank you.
moderately long. It's
And,
a little longer than this, I think. First and Second
I
Maccabees.
have no idea.
I'm pretty sure it's a little longer than this.
Jubilee, and then the alphabet of Ben Sira for third.
Okay. The alphabet of Ben Sira. If we do the
That
alphabet
got
of
my vote.
so we were reading over the alphabet of Ben Sira when I was doing my Lilith video, and it's ridiculous. It is absolutely hysterical.
Oh, yeah. We could probably do that in a pretty short amount of time.
Yeah, definitely.
Um,
It is kind of long actually, but it is really, really funny. You won't even need commentary because you'll know how ridiculous it is. In fact, it's so ridiculous that scholars are pretty sure it's a parody because it's just so ridiculous. But anyways, that's the end of the show for today.
If you enjoyed the stream, give us a like,
Share,
it,
subscribe, all the other stuff we
Yep.
shilled out, Patreon and
wish list.
wish list.
Help
that
us
stuff.
get more commentaries and books so that
All-
we can make better shows.
Yes, and all stuff is in the description. Anyways, we're
And,
going to be continuing Psalms this Sunday, so
yeah.
we will.
Wait.
Oh, okay.
Which Psalms are we continuing this Sunday?
Let's find out the exact ones. I got something here. 61 through 66.
Let me see that.
Fine, here you go.
How far down the list are we?
We're making our way through it.
We're just under halfway through the book of Psalms, aren't we?
Well, at least by chapter.
Yep. But yeah, we're most of the way through the second book of the book of Psalms.
Yeah, definitely.
So-
Either way, we will see you on Sunday.